Hello everybody and welcome back to another week in review, this time in the division's 2nd New Zealand Mechanized and 1st Fallschirmjäger, suggested a few weeks back by John Pagino. A quick note, while I do have a bunch more to review and a bunch more in the queue already, this will be my last one before the major update coming at the end of April, just because a lot of things are liable to change come that update, and I'd rather not give information that's going to be immediately invalidated. However, please feel free to leave your suggestions in the comments below, and I will either route you to where they already exist, or get to them in chronological order after the Burning Baltic update. But with all that out of the way, let's hop right into my first iteration of the 2nd New Zealand Division. Now, these two divisions that I'll be reviewing this week are actually the two newest divisions in the game, added in the most recent Nemesis DLC, the Battle of Rimini. With that said, I haven't had a chance to really look at either of these divisions, and so this will be my first time actively playing either of these, so we get the most honest review of them and the most honest build progression of them that I've had in this series such far. We begin in the Recon tab, where I've brought in some of the Greek sniper units in Phase A, as well as a card of the Staghound Mark 1s in Phase A. Now, I thought the snipers would just be a safe bet because snipers are always a good time, and for the most part, just having those extra little bit of infantry-based recon is always a great thing. However, I found that a lot of the time I was forgetting to micromanage these snipers and they were just dying off, leaving me without recon in later phases. The Staghounds were mainly there to act as a accompaniment to my opening and to suppress any enemy infantry that are unloading quickly on the front lines or that are in Opel blitzes following up those frontline engagements, just trying to pick off a few units before they actually unload, as these guys are pretty good at that, but not great in engaging enemy vehicles, anything higher than a light tank, that is. I found that throughout the week these did deal quite well with SPW 233s and 231s, so I kept them in my deck if only for that reason. Dealing with those is actually a huge part of why I kept them in here, as these guys don't have any PTRSs or any reliable infantry-based AT weapons. Moving on to the Infantry tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Field Engineers, a Phase A card of the Greek Flame Troopers, a Phase A card of the Mott Rifle Leaders, and a Phase A card of the Maoris. All in all, this was quite a heavy Phase A, and for the most part, it kind of was a bit redundant, bringing in the Field Engineers and the Flame Troops all in the same phase. However, I do address that later on in the week, so hold tight there. In Phase B, I bring in a card of the Opletes, as well as another card of the Maoris, and in Phase C, I round it all out with 2 more cards of the Opletes. I know I say this at least once per video, but please forgive my pronunciation. I am neither a native Greek speaker, nor do I understand what's going on in New Zealand, so these words are almost completely foreign to me, but I will try my best. What I will say right off the bat about this infantry tab is that these infantry are actually quite impressive, honestly. The Maoris are fantastic, featuring 2 MG42s, and the Opletes aren't bad either. They each feature 2 Brens and just a slew of mid-range rifles, so these guys are absolutely amazing at those mid-ranged engagements, and add that to the Phase A super heavy deployment of close-ranged infantry, and this infantry tab actually impressed me quite a bit. Moving on to the tank tab, in Phase A I brought in a card of the Stuart 5s, as well as a card of the Sherman 3s. In Phases B and C, I brought in more Shermans. There's really not much to this tab, the only choices being whether you want your Shermans to be commanders or just regular units, and I thought in this instance I just wanted as many Shermans on the field as I could get, rather than any commanded Shermans. That said, they oftentimes were hanging out in close proximity to my infantry engagements, so they were benefiting from the Mott rifles or from the artillery commanders just by sheer proximity to that, and because of that being buffed up to 3 stars quite often. Moving on to the support tab, they have the incredibly interesting Staghound Mark II with the HE shells. Now this guy was really great just because of the price point. For 125 points you can bring in the entire card's worth, all 5 units, and really just surround and punish a town. This is all for practically the same price as bringing in one of the heavier caliber HE guns that you could find in other tabs, such as the Sherman with the 105 or such not like that. Just the sheer rate of fire on these really lent themselves well to me surrendering out large swaths of German infantry. Moving on, I brought in the heavy machine gun in Phase A, as well as a Phase A commander. In Phase B, I brought in the Bedford Supply, as well as the even heavier machine gun, and that was mainly not very useful, honestly speaking. The heavier the machine gun, the more the price goes up, as you would guess. However, the more the price goes up, the less likely I am to bring them in for their intended role. I found that while sometimes I would bring these in, and they always did perform quite well whenever I did bring them in, I didn't bring them in often just because of the 45-point price tag. I guess I would have rather had 2 infantry squads than this. Moving on to the anti-tank tab, I have 2 cards of Phase A 6-pound guns, a Phase B card of the 6-pound gun, as well as a Phase B and C card of 17-pound guns. This is fairly standard, as I wasn't about to risk my entire life on anything like a Wolverine or a Piat team, and for the most part the 6 and 17-pound guns really perform well. I don't have anything I can take away from them, they do their job, nothing more, nothing less, so this anti-tank tab makes me happy. In the anti-air tab, I brought in a Phase A and a Phase B card of the Bofors, and again, these guys do exactly their job, no more, no less. The Bofors aren't fantastic at suppressing infantry, but they will if they need to, and they are quite great at killing planes. Moving on to the artillery tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the 3-inch Olmo in the Jeep Transport, a Phase A card of the 140mm off-map observer, and a Phase B card of the artillery command, just to help my infantry really, not really for the spotting capability, as I didn't have any radios available in this division. I've misspoken there are radios available, I just didn't bring any in. In the air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the P-51C TAC-10, which are just as quick as the Tempest, but a little less agile, little less availability per the veterancy, and a little lighter on firepower, but for the most part they'll function the same way, and because of that I really enjoy them. In Phase B I brought in a card of the Boston Mark IIIs, and in Phase C I brought in a card of the Baltimore Mark Vs. For the most part the bombers were just there to obliterate sections of the map that I found distasteful, and for the most part they did that just fine. They are relatively inexpensive as opposed to other nations' bombers of the same caliber, and for the most part they usually get away. Add that on top of the P-51 securing kills that the Bofors have begun, and my anti-air and aircraft superiority was actually quite decent, even though I only had 11 planes in this deck. Moving on to my deck at the end of the week, and this is kind of why I sped through that initial one, just because I've changed so much in it that I didn't want to talk too much about what I was thinking, because God only knows. But in the Recon tab, I've traded out the snipers for the scouts, and this isn't me indicting the snipers in any way. The snipers did their job excellently, and I can take nothing away from them. My indictment is seriously on myself, and I just wasn't micromanaging them enough, and I found that later on in the game, I just needed more Recon. Now, I could have subtracted one card here or there and brought in another card of Recon on top of the current snipers, but I opted to just take in the scouts instead. Just keep these guys because they only have 100 meter range. It's not like I really have to micromanage them, and I retain that Recon all throughout. In the infantry tab, we saw another change in that I dropped the field engineers from Phase A to Phase B. I found that a lot of the time I was engaging those 100 meters really well in Phase A, and then come Phase B and Phase C, I was completely incapable in that area. I would send the Opletes or the Maoris into that melee engagement practically, and just watch them completely fall apart against things like Stostrup or Sturmpioneer. So I really just spread these guys out, and being that I couldn't bring the flame troops in later, I swapped the field engineers over instead. I really would have rather preferred the flame troops in B and the field engineers in A, as the field engineers can come in the Jeep, and that's a little bit faster, but can't be done, so there's nothing to be done about it. In the support tab, I kept everything exactly the same, however, I could see my way into dropping the M2HB heavy machine gun. It was nice, like I said, I kept it in there because it did work well, but I just don't know if it was worth the points, so really take it or leave it. Depending on how you play the game, you might have a better use for it. In the anti-tank tab, I traded out a Phase A card of the 6-pound guns for the 17-pound gun, and I lost one gun, but I got a little bit of extra usability toward those heavier tanks or heavier vehicles, and so I just wanted to keep versatile as much as I could. So I just swapped that over, and I use these guys in tandem now. In the artillery tab, I dropped the mortars, as I've just never been very good at using mortars. I have nothing bad to say about the mortars. They performed really well the few times I did bring them in. However, I just wasn't using them as much as I'd like, and I found that I would use something else more. That something else being the 2 cards of Spitfires that I brought in the air tab. For 115 points, these things are faster than hell and drop quite a huge armament, honestly. On top of that, after they drop that armament, they're effective fighters, so I just found that these guys were more useful in every way than the mortars. I ended up affording this by dropping a Phase B card of the Opletes, and just running with the current infantry complement. I moved the field engineers later, so I should have plenty in Phase B. On top of that, I dropped the artillery, and that netted me 4 points for these 2 cards of planes. Now, this division was interesting throughout the week. I found the infantry tab was incredible. I have nothing to complain about there, and they all did their jobs excellently. The tank tab, another incredible tab. The Sherman and the Stuart are everything that I need in a tank, and they don't cost more than they need to. They're absolutely fantastic budget units, and I couldn't take anything away from them. The support tab felt a little bloated to me, and that was my own fault. I brought in too many units that costed way too much money, on top of units that were much preferable that costed much less. So for example, in Phase A, I could choose between bringing in a heavy machine gun, or I could bring in a Staghound for 10 points cheaper, and the Staghound did practically the same job, if plus or minus a few points of usability. While the heavy machine guns are great, I just found that the options that I was giving myself were not very favorable to me using all of these units. For example, come Phase B, when I had access to the M2HB heavy machine guns, I had an entire complement of the Spandu heavy machine guns that I would use instead, just 10 points cheaper again, and not really sacrificing much in the way of usability. So with that in mind, I think I would drop one or the other card of these heavy machine guns and try to focus on bringing in either more supplies for perhaps some more artillery or something else like that. I'm not entirely sure what it would be, but I think that given more time with this division, I would actually make a swap in that support tab, as it's probably the most upsetting part of it. The anti-tank tab, as usual for NATO divisions, is fantastic. I can't take anything away from it. The 57mm and the 76.2mm guns are absolutely amazing at killing enemy tanks. They don't think too highly of themselves, and so they almost always wait until side armor to do the efficient shot, and they do an excellent job at that. So I can't take anything away from that tab. However, I think my biggest indictment of this deck is the lack of any sort of specialty. It's sort of a jack of all trades division, however, master of none, and in the current meta of the game, it kind of suffers in that way. If you're going up against any specialized division, they're just going to beat you in that category, and you have to come up with a different way to deal with that. While that's not terribly an issue going up against an infantry division, use a lot of Shermans. Going up against a tank division, use a lot of your anti-tank guns. You have options in those areas, however, your options are not always the best. To give an example of this, imagine going up against, say, 3rd Fallschirmjäger. You're going up against a lot of enemy Stugs, and the Sherman really struggles against the Stug unless you can get it to a sub 1 kilometer engagement. So, a 3rd Fallschirmjäger that was intelligent enough would just dominate in the infantry battle and keep their Stugs far enough back to not engage the Shermans at optimal Sherman range, if that makes sense. This is a poor example, as there are ways around that also, and I'm not saying that there's no way to overcome any of these obstacles. What I am saying, though, is this deck does not lend itself toward having one tab that you just don't have to worry about. You have to constantly micromanage your Shermans to make sure that they're getting the best over the enemy medium tanks. You have to constantly micromanage your infantry to make sure they're getting the best over enemy infantry, so on and so forth. And so this deck is very micromanaging heavy, and I don't know that it's inherently the best Sherman-based division either. All that said, where this division really shines is its air tab. The Bostons are fantastic, the Spitfires are absolutely amazing, and the P-51 is a god in the air. I mean, I can only think of a few planes that actually perform better than this in the air superiority role, and because of that, I'm just thoroughly impressed with this 115-point fighter. Another area of huge fun, although I said it is quite micromanage heavy, is the infantry tab. All of these infantry do quite well in their respective engagements, if they require a little bit of babysitting here and there. For the most part, these guys are going to beat enemy Grenadier, Panzer Grenadier, or just the base shock infantry that the Germans have to offer handily, without any issue. While there are exceptions to this, these guys do perform much better per point than those enemy shock infantry. Once you get into the enemy Fallschirmjäger or the enemy Baglite series, it's anyone's game really. Those guys are just going to rip you in half, even if you spent an apt amount of points to combat them. This division feels most at home the more map area that you have to cover. Because of all your units, shall we say, innate lack of armor or innate lack of tankiness, the more spread out you are, the better, as enemy heavy tanks will struggle to pin down Shermans on multiple fronts. Just sheer overwhelming front presence is really this deck's biggest thing. And so with that in mind, the fewer players that are involved in a game, the better this division seemed to perform. I don't know how this does in 1v1s, however, in 2v2s I found my most success while playing this division. In 4v4s, given the overcrowded nature of the front lines, you had a lot tighter of a front to contest, and because of that you were fighting a lot tighter of an enemy front, and oftentimes one Tiger would shut down 3 or 4 Shermans all at once while spending half the points. Again, there are ways around this, but just bringing up my thoughts as I found them. All in all, of the A-rated divisions that I've played thus far, this one would probably be the most difficult. While I can see its uses, and it was fun to play for the most part, I didn't have any overwhelming issues with it, it doesn't really push all that well, and when it does push, it's quite costly. Perhaps the answer to this is to bring in more artillery, however, I've never had a good relationship with the 25-pound gun, and that's the heaviest piece of artillery that's available to this division. All in all though, let's go ahead and move on to my first iteration of 1st Fallschirmjäger. Now, it was just a couple weeks back that I actually reviewed 3rd Fallschirmjäger, and this incorporates a lot of the same elements, but solves a lot of the problems that it had also. It incorporates some new ones, but we'll get to those as we see them. In the Recon tab, I began by bringing in the Fallschirm Scharfschütze, just in the same vein as the Greek snipers that I was bringing in. Snipers are always good, and they're excellent infantry-based recon. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the Panzerabwehr, and this was to serve as my Phase B Panzerschreck teams, as well as excellent recon. I absolutely love these units. They're probably some of my favorite recon in the game, second only to the Ranger Marauders. Moving on to the Infantry tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the OST Legionary. These are just excellent, almost Ersatztruppen. I have nothing else to say about them. They're fantastic. I brought in a Phase A card of the Fallschirmführer, and this is just an excuse to get an extra 2 FG-42s, and a Phase A card of the Sturmpioneer. Rounding all of this out was my Phase A card of 1-star Fallschirmjäger. I do the Fallschirmjäger at 1 star just to bring them up to that 3 stars, as they go through their ammunition quite quickly on the FG-42 especially, and because of that I want all of those rounds to be as accurate as possible. Bringing them up to 3 stars increases that rate of fire, but also increases that accuracy, so I think it's worth it. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the Fallschirm Stostrup, and these guys are just great. For 25 points, they come in the horse transport, pack 2 Molotov cocktails per squad. On top of that, they have 3 FG-42s, meaning they're excellent even at mid-range, which is unlikely for Stostrup, and they're amazing in every way. I can't take anything away from these guys. I use them as infantry support occasionally. I'll occasionally use them as close-ranged infantry. There's just nothing these guys can't do. In Phase B, I also brought in a card of the Fallschirmjäger and a card of the Fallschirm Pioneer. Rounding all of this out, in Phase C, I bring in my last card of Fallschirmjäger. Now in the tank tab, you have a bevy of tanks available to you, but let me see if I can guide you through which tanks I chose and why. In Phase A, I brought in the Tiger. I also brought in the Tiger. In Phase B, I brought in the Tiger, and in Phase C, I brought in the Tiger. I don't know if I went too fast for you guys there, but given the slew of options available in this tank tab, it's a little tricky to navigate, so I'll do my best to explain come the end of the week why I went with the Tiger. In the support tab in Phase A, I brought in the SMG-42, excellent option, as well as a Phase A commander. In Phase B, I brought in the Opelpitz munition, as well as the LG-42 support gun. I absolutely love these things. They're excellent at killing light vehicles, medium tanks even, and they suppress infantry to an unholy degree. I love them in every way. In the anti-tank tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Panzerschreck teams, a Phase A card of the Pak-40s, and a Phase A card of no-star Nashorns. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the Jagdpanzer IV, as well as the Pak-43. All in all, this anti-tank tab is really robust. Like, it has access to almost everything I'd need. My only want or ask would be for something like a Pak-38 also, but that's a bit much. This anti-tank tab is fantastic. I can't take anything away from it. In the anti-air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Flak 38 20mm, a Phase A card of the SDKFZ 7/2, and 2 Phase B cards of the Flak 36 88mm. Now, for all intents and purposes, these guys are just stat clones of the Flat 43s. There are a few minor differences, such as the loss of health in the Flak 36 over the Flak 41, but for the most part, these are going to perform in the exact same way, and I love them just the same. In the artillery tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the Geb 105s, again, one of my favorite howitzers in the game, and a Phase B card of the Fallschirm battery Führer. In the air tab, I bring in a card of the ME 109 G6/R2s in Phase A. These guys are excellent fighter bombers. They're some of my favorite for promoting that early game snowball effect, meaning that for 105 points, you can pick these guys up in a tick. You can use them to devastating effect, and they typically get away in Phase A. The more often that they get away, the more often that you're getting points with them on bombing runs or on anti-aircraft runs, the more and more these guys end up being worth, and less the enemy is capable of dealing with them. You see this most notably in decks like 20th Panzer, where you have these things just coming in on constant bombing raids, just dissuading the enemy from spending points on AA through sheer lack of points on the front line. I also bring in a card of the Phase A RE 2005 Series Zeros, and while these guys aren't the best ASF, they are the best available, and I really enjoy them for what they're worth. For 105 points, I don't think that I could ask for anything better, and they do travel quite quickly. Moving on to Phases B and C, I bring in more generic bombers. The ones in Phase C are more expensive, but other than that, there's no difference between how I use them. Just piles of them to bomb enemy tanks to death or to bomb piles of enemy infantry to death. I've said it before and I'll say it again, all of these HE bombers, to me, are just things that erase sections of the map. It really doesn't matter how much they cost, what munitions they drop, so on and so forth. All that matters is their ability to erase sections of the map, and the Ju-88 is typically really good at that. Moving on to my deck at the end of the week, and I only made one change really. I dropped the Phase B card of Jagdpanzers in favor of a Phase B card of Pupchins at 2 stars. Now, I brought in the Pupchins simply to act as a longer-ranged Panzerschreck come Phase B, because oftentimes I was fighting for cities or forests where I could quite easily sneak these things around, and I was quite often running into heavy tanks that I was having trouble dealing with any other way. On top of this, I found that the Jagdpanzer was kind of redundant, being that I had the Nashorns if I needed a lot of firepower, or I had the Tiger E's if I needed to put something on a hill and have it resist enemy fire. For the most part, the only enemy vehicle that stands a chance against the Tiger or the Jagdpanzer is the IS-2, and it's not like the Jagdpanzer does better against it than the Tiger, so I just ended up using the Tigers for the same role. All that said, I found this division to be quite a lot of fun. I really enjoy all the Fallschirmjäger divisions that are available in the game. I love something speaks to me on a primal level about just bringing in infantry that are better than the enemy infantry, regardless of what the enemy infantry are. And that's what Fallschirmjäger are. Fallschirmjäger are better in close range than most close-ranged infantry. They're better at medium range than most medium-ranged infantry. I really just love them to death, and for a 35-point price tag, they are quite pricey. However, I feel that they earn that price. On top of that, you take the biggest weakness about 3rd Fallschirmjäger, that was the lack of any sort of heavy tank and everything being hull-locked, and you supplement it with now you're just Tigers, that's all you are. While, again, these are quite expensive, and that lends itself toward being a very expensive division between bringing in the Tigers, the Nashorns, the Pak-43s, and the entire infantry tab being incredibly pricey, all things told. It does lend itself toward being a very, very pedantic division. You have to be very careful with the units you bring in because losing any one is devastating, and oftentimes just as bad as losing 2 of any similar unit. On top of this, another thing that I could levy against this is the lack of any sort of expendable vehicles. Your Tigers are amazing. I love them to death. However, you're not going to use them on the front lines as callously as you would use, say, Panzer IVs or something of the like. These guys aren't going to go into forests with you, as they're more than likely just going to die to enemy Panzerschrecks that are hiding in a bush nearby. So you lose a lot of that sort of forward usability of the Tigers. They're excellent at sitting back and taking shots while returning fire at long range, 2 kilometers. However, at close ranged engagements, you're going to be completely lacking in any sort of vehicle support. So in that way, the 3rd Fallschirmjäger really pulls ahead of this, as that's the only thing that I can really compare this to. Between the Panzer L6s and the SPWs available in the Recon tab, those guys really do excel at those close ranged infantry support roles, While the Tiger can be used in that way, I would really stray away from using it like that. To supplement that, the GEB 105s could be used just to sort of provide that support on top of the LG42s. However, the GEB 105s, for some reason in this division, do not come in with the access to the supply transport. So that's a little bit more micromanaging that you have to do with those on top of the already limited supply situation that you have to begin with. Honestly, I would probably see my way into dropping perhaps the Flak 38s or perhaps something else just to bring in an extra supply truck, because it's almost impossible to keep the GEB 105 supplied while also making sure all of your infantry have FG42 ammo that they go through like it's a fire sale. All in all, honestly, while I did really enjoy playing this division, if you're looking at playing one or the other of 1st Fallschirmjäger or 3rd Fallschirmjäger, my vote goes towards 3rd. It has access to a much bigger support tab and much more usable units, being that it has the cool blitz munition to get munitions up to the front lines easier. It has the better infantry between the two, and it has much more infantry support options. While this lends itself toward being more versatile, that versatility comes at a cost of losing what this division is meant to do. While the Fallschirmjäger is still fantastic, and I love this infantry tab to death, it overperforms in almost every way, it isn't going to overperform to the same degree as 3rd Fallschirmjäger would. That said, if you're working as sort of a support role, this deck is amazing. On a 4v4 map, for example, where you're liable to have overlap of fronts with one of your friendlies, this deck outperforms 3rd Fallschirmjäger in almost every way. The anti-aircraft tab is practically the same, but where it really excels is the anti-tank tab, which is capable of actually boxing IS-2s in this division, be it with the Nashorn or the Pak-43. It's capable of boxing most other heavy tanks with the Tiger, or again with the Nashorn or Pak-43, and it's absolutely fantastic in an infantry support role where one of your allies is forming the actual front line and you're providing fire support. So in direct opposition to 2nd New Zealand from earlier, I'd say that this deck performs better the more people are involved in the game. Probably even better in a 10v10 if you could find a 10v10 that didn't immediately give you cancer. However, I saw my most success with this division in 4v4s. And all told, it's not a difficult division to play. While you do have to babysit your units to make sure they don't go down to enemy artillery or such not, for the most part, each of these units does their job perfectly fine autonomously. What I mean by that is a Fallschirmjäger squad left alone in a city is likely to kill enemy infantry, at least totaling their cost. God forbid they go any further. However, they are more than likely to be shelled to death if you're not paying attention, so you really do have to micromanage them if you want to make the most out of them. All that said, that is going to do it for this week in review of 2nd New Zealand and 1st Fallschirmjäger. Remember that I won't be reviewing any more divisions until the release of Burning Baltic, as that is just going to be such a substantial change to how tank combat works and a few other things that I just don't think it's worthwhile to give any more criticisms or critiques on divisions and then have that gigantic update come out and then completely invalidate most of my criticisms. All that said though, if you'd like to leave a suggestion in the comments below, I will route you to where they exist, or I will get to them after that update. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I hope you've learned something.